Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Poser. I'm the Outreach Librarian for the NOAA Central Library, and I will be your technical host today. And with that, welcome to Responsible Use of Metrics Week. We hope you are enjoying our emails that are going out daily. We have one more email for tomorrow, and today is our second seminar of the week. And this one is on the money, on the topic, responsible use of metrics. This is going to be done by our two lovely speakers today, Sarah Davis, who's our Senior Bibliometrics Librarian, and Keith Locantore, who is also working on the Bibliometrics team on assignment at the NOAA Central Library as a contract librarian. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keith to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning for me. I'm on the West Coast, but for some of you, it might be noon or other times. My name is Keith Locantore. As Katie mentioned, I'm a librarian at the NOAA Central Library, and it's a pleasure to be with you. So today we're going to be talking about the responsible use of bibliometrics. So there have been some other recent talks this week. Our colleague Hope gave a talk on Tuesday, which was kind of a Bibliometrics 101 introduction. So if that's something you're interested in, we definitely encourage you to check out that talk. So we will be mentioning some specific metrics and things, but we won't be taking a deep dive into those. So if you want to learn more, we are going to share some resources about those where you can get some more information. So what do we mean when we say responsible use of bibliometrics? We're referring to the ethical and appropriate use of citation-based metrics, altmetrics, and other methods of quantitatively evaluating research. So with bibliometrics, we're using publications as a proxy for research in order to quantitatively analyze certain aspects of that research. It's never going to capture the whole picture, and there are limitations to it, and that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about, going through some of those limitations and considerations when using these metrics. But they can indeed be a powerful tool for assessment and evaluation. But we just really want to make sure that people understand how they can be used appropriately and at times inappropriately. So if they are used appropriately for the task at hand, it can really increase the robustness and utility of an analysis. All right, so with that, we'll move to the next slide. Okay, so before we take a deep dive, let's just discuss briefly a few of the limitations that we might want to consider in using bibliometrics for evaluation of research. So at the NOAA Library, a big tool that we use is called Web of Science. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's a really great tool made available by Clarivate, and it's really helpful. It's a major tool we use in tracking and analyzing NOAA research, specifically journal articles. But that is something to consider, that it's a great tool for tracking and analyzing journal articles, but it's not going to track, for example, like internal NOAA documents, the gray literature, which is a big part of what NOAA produces. It's not going to have you have to wait for it to be indexed, so it's not going to have it immediately. It has to be indexed, which can take a period of months or longer before it enters Web of Science. And it's only going to represent a portion of existing publications that are out there. It's pretty comprehensive. It captures a lot of stuff, but not everything. There's certainly journals which aren't captured by it. So that's just something to consider. Even though we find it to be a very, very valuable tool, it does have limitations. And so that's just to start with, that's something to acknowledge and be aware of. And something else to consider is that metrics can be a valuable tool, but they can be vulnerable to manipulation by authors and publishers. We're not going to spend too much time diving into that and the way that can be done, but it's a possibility. It happens, and I think it's really important to be cognizant of that when considering these things. Some worry that the use of bibliometrics for evaluation can influence research and publishing practices, and this really isn't limited to bibliometrics and research and publishing. I mean, this is a problem when we're using any kind of metrics. Just think about the world we live in today. Numbers, metrics are just so commonly used, which is understandable, but it comes with limitations and some issues. I mean, there's something called Campbell's Law that states that the more important metric is to a social decision, in making a social decision, the more likely it is to be manipulated in that social decision making. So basically, think of like the idea of like teaching to the test. You know, we have these standardized tests, but then some argue that instead of evaluating quality of teaching and students, you know, it's vulnerable to manipulation, where you end up teaching to the test and you're changing the practice of teaching that you're actually doing. Same thing with like universities. You know, there's the famous lists of top universities, but then some argue that when you have this set of criteria that evaluate what are supposedly the most prestigious universities and rank them, that can be vulnerable to manipulation, and then you have universities changing their practices to change the numbers that are going to be used to evaluate that. So it's just always a possibility. And again, I'm not going to get too much more into it beyond that, but it's just something to be aware of. It does happen, and it can impact scientific research. And just go back for one more second before we move on. And then just the last consideration before we move on is it can be difficult to assess the relative scalability of a given metric. So there aren't exactly hard and fast rules here, but some metrics will be appropriate at a given level, but not appropriate at another level. So maybe a certain metric might be useful within a large organization, but not within like a smaller subset of the organization within an office, or just a smaller sample size. Using it would be inappropriate. And we'll get into some more considerations around that later in the presentation. So, okay, so yes, we'll move on to the next slide then. Okay, the Leiden Manifesto. This is something that's going to help us guide how we're going to think about this coming presentation, how we think about responsible use of metrics. So in 2015, there were a group of experts that met to propose a set of 10 principles for the measurement of research performance. And then this manifesto was published in the scientific journal Nature. And so it's considered kind of a gold standard in terms of like the considerations and responsible use of metrics. So we find it to be very valuable in helping us to formulate how we approach thinking about the responsible use of metrics. So we have listed here the 10 principles that they enumerated during that conference, and so yeah, so basically they found, kind of like I alluded to before, that in research evaluation, it's become so routine and often relies on metrics. So increasingly, this use of data, it can threaten to damage the scientific system. So it can really be useful to kind of think through some of these things in assessing how we use these metrics. So, so about 5 of these we're going to use to discuss in more depth, and there are other 5 that are really useful, but we won't be discussing this particular talk. But we welcome you to look into those further, and if you're interested in beyond what we discuss here. So move on to the next slide. Okay, so starting with considerations of particular bibliometric best practices, it's important to always remember that bibliometrics are a supplement to and not a replacement for qualitative assessment. So it's great, they have they can be really valuable and a really essential tool in that toolbox for assessing scientific research, but you never want to just use them in isolation, and they should just supplement what's the qualitative assessment of that research. So with that in mind, bibliometrics can provide a concrete, quantitative way of measuring the impact of research. So that can be really useful, and as such, they can reduce bias in assessment. If you're making just a purely qualitative assessment, there can be bias that creeps in, and if you have quantitative tools in your toolbox to help supplement that, especially if you have multiple tools to look at it from multiple angles, that can be a really valuable thing. And it can be relatively easy and efficient to produce and reproduce, and that's important. It's never going to replace expert analysis, but it's something that can supplement that, and someone else can use the same set of research, look at the numbers, run the same numbers, see if they get the same thing, and that's really valuable. But bibliometrics, they can't distinguish between positive and negative citations. So citations are a really key thing that's used in a lot of different bibliometric tools. But it's important to remember that there are limitations when we're looking at citations. You have to think about like what goes into a citation, what does it mean, what's behind it, and it can be valuable, but it's limited. Sometimes people cite other papers for positive reasons. It's an important part of their research. They're building on it. They want to reference it, and that's great. At other times, sometimes people will cite other papers for negative reasons. Maybe they're refuting that previous research, and you have a large body of people citing a paper to refute it. That doesn't, that's actually a negative reason. And so if you're just going by pure numbers of citations of that paper, it could lead you astray in thinking about what that means. And kind of like I alluded to before, there can be manipulations of what goes into these numbers as well, and that's something to consider in terms of what's behind those numbers and how meaningful they are. So bibliometrics can't quantify other researcher contributions such as mentoring, developing software, and other products, presentations at conferences. I mean, so there's a lot of things that researchers can produce that just aren't going to be captured by that, and that's just something important to remember. It's just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and as I already discussed, it doesn't replace expert judgment. So it can just help add to that expert judgment and give you another view that can be helpful. So quantitative metrics can help challenge biases and enhance assessment, but are not appropriate substitutes for informed judgment. Okay, go to the next slide. So another consideration in bibliometric best practices, assessments of individual researchers should never be based solely on bibliometrics. So there are many factors that can be important, impact the usefulness of bibliometrics for assessing individual researchers. One of the most commonly used is called the H-index, and basically it just means you have a researcher that produces 10 research papers, each of which are cited at least 10 times. That would be an H-index of 10. You have a researcher who produces 12 papers, each of which is cited at least 12 times. You have an H-index of 12. And that's a commonly used metric, and it can be useful, certainly, but there are limitations to it. It skews in favor of longer tenured people, longer career researchers. Someone who's newer to the field, it's just not going to capture that, and so there's something to consider. You really have to take it with a grain of salt how you're using any metric, and particularly one like that. And field of research. Sarah, in just a moment, is going to be diving more deeply into how different disciplines and fields of research can influence, aspects of metrics and evaluation of these metrics. So I'll just leave it at that and mention it, and she's going to discuss that a little bit more in just a moment. And the availability of quality data for analysis. Publication and citation data is not available for all sources, particularly in certain fields such as economics and archaeology, and again, that's for certain fields, they use data, they publish, the way they cite data, just these different publication practices can vary widely within different fields, and that can really affect the metrics that, if you use given metrics to evaluate a field, you have to just be really careful when doing that across fields. And as I mentioned, there can be subject to gaming of metrics, some metrics can be exploited to artificially boost bibliometric scores, and one hopes that that isn't commonly a practice among researchers, but it does happen, and it's important to be aware of, and just when we're considering the use of bibliometric data, it can happen, and we just need to be cognizant of that. And we're putting a lot of stress on these numbers in evaluation of researchers. So bibliometrics can only assess publications and their use. They're only one part of a researcher's work, as we discussed, and we just really need to make sure that it's just one tool in the toolbox, and we're using a wide range of tools to assess someone, even within bibliometrics, not just relying on one indicator, but multiple indicators in assessing a given set of research. So it's only one part of the story and should be balanced with many tools in the toolbox. Expert assessment, peer review, all these things are crucial, and these metrics can supplement that, but not. But it's only part of the picture. So go to the next slide. I think Sarah is going to discuss this further, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Keith. So our next best practice that I want to talk about is to remember that publication and citation practices vary widely in different fields. Keith already touched on this, but I wanted to get into more detail. Different disciplines have different citation, publication, and research culture, and this is reflected in the metrics that we look at. For example, what we have here is in mathematics, researchers tend to publish fewer articles over the course of their career, and each of those articles tend to cite even fewer references. While on the other end of things, in cell biology, researchers publish many more articles, and each of those papers is likely to cite many more references. So this means that lots of numbers are going to be very different. There's also issues with the number of authors on individual papers. In some fields, there may only be 1 or 2, whereas in other fields, there may be a dozen or even 100 authors on one paper. So this means that authors in those fields are getting a lot more citations and publication numbers. These variations across disciplines are reflected in sometimes large differences in metrics. A good example, I think, is the H-index, which we've already talked about is kind of skewed, but researchers in mathematics, for instance, are unlikely to have an H-index over the entire course of their career that tops over 20. So that's a fairly low number when you compare it to a field like something in biomedicine, where a researcher may have an H-index as high as, say, 200, meaning that they've had 200 papers that received 200 or more citations. This is a very large gap. A mathematics researcher with an H-index of 20 is kind of a rock star, but if you compared that to somebody in biomedicine, it doesn't look so good. So you have to have that in the context. There are a number of field normalizing metrics, such as the category normalized citation impact metric from Web of Science, which we do use sometimes, and citation percentiles, which we in the library use more often because we can kind of calculate those ourselves. And they attempt to account for these variations between fields, and they do generally a really good job, but they are imperfect metrics, and we'll talk about that in a second too. So the thing to remember here is that most metrics can't be used to compare researchers or work in different disciplines. This isn't just for individuals, it's also for looking at, say, agencies. What gets published more in one area isn't going to get published as much in others. They're not going to get cited as much. It isn't fair or equitable to compare across different fields. Next slide. So the next thing to be aware of is that metrics may not indicate what we think they do, and we also need to be wary of false precision. Citation counts are not necessarily an indicator of quality even though we do have research that says that it is likely that article quality and citation count does correlate in a lot of cases, it isn't perfect. A paper might be cited many times for negative reasons. It gets published, other researchers think it's garbage, so they publish lots of papers citing that original paper to say that it's garbage or to refute it. It's much more professional than just saying it's garbage, obviously. On the other hand, a research paper might have a large impact on the field or even society, but not have that impact reflected in citation accounts. A published study might result in policy changes or best practices in medicine changing, schools changing the way that they teach students, but they're not cited in that many papers. So we have to keep that in mind too, that it isn't the whole picture, which is, you know, kind of the running theme of this presentation and responsible use. We also need to be wary of what's called false precision. So some metrics, like journal impact factor, for instance, and the now defunct eigenfactor, go up to multiple decimal points. I believe journal impact factor is 2, eigenfactor was 3 or 4. And they do this in order to facilitate ranking of the journals or whatever it is that they're measuring. But distinguishing between journals or organizations or individuals based on these very precise looking metrics doesn't really make sense. They imply that the underlying data is more comprehensive and accurate than is really likely to be true. All these metrics are based on citation metrics, and as we talked about earlier, there are a lot of problems with collecting really high quality citation metrics. There will always be some citations that we just don't know about. And this is more true in some fields like economics and other social science research areas. But we have to remember when we're using the metrics that the underlying data does have flaws. And so making decisions based on those very precise numbers just doesn't really make sense. The bottom line here is that a high citation count may not necessarily mean that a paper is high quality, although it might, nor does a low citation count indicate low quality. And we always have to remember that some metrics are going to imply more precision than is truly possible. Anything that looks really precise probably isn't as precise as they want you to think it is. We're always trying to perfect the indicators that we use in bibliometrics, but there's always more to be done. We always have to keep that in mind. Katie, next slide. So our final best practice is to show your work. The library is, you might have seen all of it, very big on open science these days. Being open and transparent is very important in scientific research. It promotes efficiency, collaboration, equity, and reproducibility. And this concept is the same for bibliometrics. Also, openness allows those who are being evaluated using metrics to verify the accuracy of that evaluation, which increases the equity of that process. And it also helps us ensure data quality. We make better data and better analyses when we're documenting it, when we're really taking the time to create a better quality product and make sure that people can see that product. So this is for us or for anyone else doing bibliometrics. It's really important to document what data you're using. This is something that is sometimes hard for us to remember now that we have tools like Insights, which is great, and you can get it through the library. That you can do your bibliometrics. It does a nice little analysis and visualization for you. You need to download the data set used as well as the analysis and the visualization so that you have this complete package that you can come to and check later to verify that it is accurate, that is what you wanted to look at. You also want to document how the data was collected, so which source you used, what your parameters were, how you parsed that data, and how you analyzed it. document your methodology. It's just like in a research study. And we want to document which tools were used to conduct the analysis, and if there are visualizations, what tools were used to create those visualizations. Different tools have different features. For instance, a visualization of a network created in one tool, it might look very different and tell a very different story than one created in a different tool. This is something that we've struggled with. We try to be very consistent with which tools we use, but that's not always possible. It's not always desirable. So it's important to make sure we document that, make sure that it's open and people can go back and see what it is. There is a tool that we don't really use anymore called Gephi, and it was specifically called out a few years ago for being used in graphs produced for congressional hearings because it used an algorithm that was ultimately unpredictable. So it was not reproducible, but people were making sweeping policy decisions and voting on legislation based on graphs that could not be reliably reproduced. There are consequences to the way that we do things. So we like to make sure that at the very least we have documented it, we've thought it out, so we can go back and look at that process and really question how it was done and make sure it holds up to scrutiny. So I think I just said what our bottom line was there, and we can go to the next slide. All right, so to kind of wrap things up, I wanted to give some somewhat more specific examples of what we would consider inappropriate uses of metrics. These are not like you can't ever do them, but just something to be wary of. Number one is evaluating the work of a researcher or a group of researchers based on the journal impact factors of journals they're publishing in. Journal impact factor is a great tool for evaluating a journal as a whole, but it ultimately doesn't tell us anything about the quality of individual articles. Nature is one of the highest journals. It has one of the highest journal impact factors out there. There are articles in Nature that never get more than 5 citations. That is obviously not reflective of the average, but you have to keep that in mind, that there are still low performers in a high-performing journal. And the researchers who publish in those journals aren't necessarily really impactful or really, it just doesn't say anything about their work personally. So that would be what I would consider an inappropriate use. We are talking about H-index a lot today, but just to say again that it's inappropriate to compare the portfolios of researchers at disparate points in their careers or who are working in different fields. H-index really is skewed in favor of researchers who have longer publishing careers and towards researchers in fields that tend to publish more. If you have someone who is an early career researcher, they may have published 4 papers that got over 100 citations each. The highest H-index possible for them is 4. This will probably increase as they publish more throughout their career, but using that one score is really, it's really a bad way of looking at their performance because it is not representative of their work, not only not their work as a whole, but of the work that they have done that is being used to calculate that score. And finally, it's best not to use metrics to set arbitrary limits or cutoffs that are used for decision making. It can create a situation where, let's say you use the journal impact factor to decide what journals to submit to, and say, I'm only going to submit to journals with a journal impact factor of 15, and you end up submitting to a journal that is not the best choice for your specific paper. That results in not reaching your target audience and ultimately could mean that you have less of an impact and fewer citations. An example that is close to my heart is that a little over 10 years ago, the library had a very large budget cut and we had to cut a lot of our journals, and that decision was made solely based on cost per use metrics. It did save money. It was done really quickly, but the result was we ended up with a collection of journals that did not suit our users' needs. We had a bunch of low-cost journals that no one ever used, and a lot of researchers who couldn't get a hold of the articles that they needed in order to write their own papers. We eventually went back to the drawing board, drew up a bunch of other metrics, because cost per use isn't useless. If something costs $150 every time we cite it, that's going to be a problem. But we were able to look at things like how many papers we were citing in that journal, how many papers we were publishing in that journal, whether or not it fit into the fields of research that NOAA is publishing in, and make that decision from there. So arbitrary limits bad. Using a metric as part of a matrix, much better. So really, at the end of the day, it's important to be aware of the uses and limitations of bibliometrics as a whole, and also every metric that's used. And we in the library on the bibliometrics team are always here to help and happy to talk about this stuff. So that wraps us up. Katie, next slide. These are some additional resources if you would like to check out the Leiden Manifesto yourself. We also have a LibGuide for bibliometrics for our services, and a lot of this information is there. And we urge you to check out Web of Science. You can do some of this yourself. It links, if you are a NOAA employee, it links to Insights, where we have an account. And you can use those tools yourself to evaluate your own research. We are also happy to help out with that. And you can always just get in touch with us. So without further ado, if there are any questions.
No questions, but definitely a kudos, a big thank you to Sarah and Keith for this excellent information. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie.